There has been a lot of talk recently about the Trudeau Liberals putting a tax back on trucks and SUVs. The Liberals say, we're just misinformed. But to talk about this in more detail is our political reporter, Brian Lilley, who joins us once again from Toronto. So, Brian, Minister Guilbeault said it was just a recommendation and that the government's only considering it at this point in time. What have you heard?
This all started because, longtime friend of mine, former colleague Chris Sims from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, wrote a column for us at the Toronto Sun, Hal, that said, "Hey, look at the back of their 2013 emissions plan. What's in there? Expanding the green levy. This is an existing tax, but it's only on really big, what they called back in 2007 when they brought it in a gas guzzlers tax. But the proposal would expand it to Ford F-150s, Ram 3500s, Jeep Wranglers, popular SUVs, popular trucks, and would add between $1,000 and $4,000 per vehicle." So Chris pointed at that and said, look, this is in their emissions plan. The government said, no, this is disinformation. He accused Chris Sims of being partisan and that the Taxpayers Federation was out to get them. But it's right in their report. Now, they claim it's just in the annex and it's a recommendation from an outside group. Hal, I've been around government a very long time. You know what they don't publish? Recommendations from outside groups they don't agree with. And I want to point you to something else. When Minister Guilbeault, before he entered politics, he used to be the spokesperson for a group called Equiterre. It's a Quebec-based environmental group. They submitted in 2017 budget recommendations. Here's what we think the government should do. It included expanding this green levy in exactly the same way as the annex in the government report calls for. So, what are we to believe? We're to believe that the Trudeau Liberals are obviously scared of putting an extra $1,000 in tax on the number one selling vehicle in the country. That's the F-150. And a lot of pickup trucks and SUVs are in the top 10. And they're also running scared from this. They don't know what to do. So they're saying it's not going to happen. But I seem to recall hearing time and again before the 2019 election that they were not going to increase the carbon tax. There were no plans. This was not going to happen. These are just reports from bureaucrats at Environment Canada. Well, guess what they did? They upped the tax, and I think they would do it again here if we stop looking.
So, Brian, while the Prime Minister says he won't put a green tax on trucks and SUVs, they're talking about the need to reduce emissions and to move ahead with more electric vehicles, if only we can actually afford an electric vehicle. Have you seen the prices lately? Now, Brian, at the same time, Prime Minister Trudeau is also getting blasted over his own travel plans and carbon footprint. Tell me more.
Yeah, so we flew out to Victoria, British Columbia a week ago to say we need to move towards electric vehicles. And look, electric vehicles are getting better and they're getting cheaper. That's good news. They still cost more than a regular one. They're still a premium. I've heard rave reviews from people who've driven the F-150 electric to go back to the pickup truck. Apparently it moves great, but it does cost more. But he says, well, we've got to do this. And he's flying all over the country. He flies from Ottawa to Victoria, then to Edmonton, then on to Laval, Quebec. And then he flies back to Whistler to go snowboarding for the weekend. He was in Whistler from Wednesday of last week, right across the Easter break. He left sometime late Monday because now he's flown to the other side of the country again. This guy, if he actually believed what he was saying about emissions, maybe he would have done the tour Laval, Edmonton, Victoria, and then he just has to pop back over to Vancouver so he can go snowboarding in Whistler. This isn't about him having a vacation, Hal. We can all use downtime, but this is about flying all over the country from one side to the other and back again while telling the rest of us to drop our emissions. Just his flights alone were more than half of what the average Canadian emits in carbon in a full year. That's just for his portion of the flights.
Now, speaking of flying across the country, Brian, our Prime Minister's in New Brunswick to make a health announcement. This comes as premiers say Trudeau has not really done enough to fund health care despite multiple promises. What are the premiers saying?
Premier John Horgan, who speaks for the Council of the Federation, has gone on the offensive and was doing a bunch of interviews last week saying, hey, look, it'd be nice to have a national dental plan. That sounds great. But how about funding primary health care? So that we can do the hip and knee replacement, so that we can have a human resources strategy for the primary care sector, like making sure there are nurses and doctors there to care for you when you need them. That's been an issue over the past couple of years. The Trudeau government has refused to sit down and do what they promised they would do. In the 2015 election, they promised a summit, they promised a new health accord, they promised long term stable funding. Instead, they implemented the plan that Stephen Harper had put in place that they said would amount to cuts. Those so called cuts, which is just a smaller increase than they'd been getting, um, those didn't take effect until 2 years into Trudeau's mandate. So he's actually providing less money for the healthcare system than Stephen Harper did. He is refusing to meet with premiers to discuss this in any substantial way, but he's going around saying, hey, let's partner up on new programs. Premiers are rightly concerned, worried, and skeptical about what's going on this, and saying, you know what, let's have a real conversation about healthcare funding. You take all the money up in taxes, start sharing it with us the way that you promised so that we can fund the healthcare system properly.
Brian, Edmonton-based discount carrier Flair Airlines faces an uncertain future. Now, the Canadian Transportation Agency says the airline may not be Canadian under law, even though the Trudeau government put more than, 11 million taxpayers' dollars into the airline? Could the cheap flight airline be grounded?
Well, that's what passengers have to worry about, is that the government, if they follow the letter of the law, could come in and say, okay, Flair, you're not Canadian. At the beginning of May, you can't fly anymore. Your license is revoked. I don't think that's going to happen. And Flair will address this issue later in the week with a news conference. But, this is frustrating, Hal. We need discount carriers in Canada. They've had them in the United States for a long time. They've had them in the UK, across continental Europe. People are able to get cheap discount flights. Now, it's not for everyone. You're going to pay if you want to take on check a bag. You're going to pay if you want to do a carry-on. But if you want a cheap getaway flight, it's a great way to travel that other parts of the world have had. Flair Airlines took some extra funding from a US-based company to help them during the COVID pandemic, and that's what's at issue. But that funding was coming from the investment firm at the same time as we had the Federal Economic Development Agency from Southern Ontario giving them $3 million. Prairie Can, what used to be called Western Economic Diversification, was giving them $8.3 million at the same time as they're getting this funding. Didn't they do their due diligence? So, what frustrates the rest of the airline industry, whether it's Air Canada or Air Transat or WestJet, is that, hey, look, we're following the rules. We're not taking this. You guys have now put money into the company, and you're going to decide if they get to keep the license. You're both the referee and the player. This has just put the Trudeau government in an awful situation. I'm not sure you can get more Canadian, more of an Ottawa story than saying an airline based in Canada isn't Canadian, even as the federal government puts money into it.
Let me ask you something. If Flair Airlines is grounded, where will that leave passengers without insurance?
It would leave them stranded. Now, the company has asked for an 18-month extension. I've been speaking to some industry sources that believe that Flair will get an extension, won't be as long as 18 months, but they will get an extension to refinance so that it is 100% Canadian. I don't think the Trudeau government wants to be in the situation of being the ones that strand passengers and shut down a discount airline because of technicalities. The rules are the rules and they have to be enforced, but you don't want to be leaving people stranded. So they'll probably give the company time to restructure and bring themselves in line with the rules.
A number of Canadian parents had to scramble during the COVID-19 pandemic to find alternate arrangements when schools and daycares were closed, Brian. But a new ruling for federal employees shows that we're not all in this together and that federal workers actually got a special deal.
This was a grievance by the Public Service Alliance of Canada, the largest public sector union in the country. And they said that, look, our members shouldn't have had to have used sick days or vacation days or parental leave or family leave days in order to look after their kids. Well, that's what a lot of other Canadians had to do. These guys were getting paid no matter what, but they wanted to keep their extra leave days that they're paid for and just get what's called leave with pay, a 699 pay. There were thousands upon thousands of federal workers on that system. Billions of dollars were spent because some federal workers were told, go home to work, even though they couldn't. So they sat at home and collected their pay. There were no layoffs, not of any significance at the federal level. I don't recall many in provincial governments or municipal governments across the country. So civil servants definitely had a better lot than people working in the private sector. We saw millions of Canadians lose their jobs or lose significant number of hours during the pandemic. That didn't happen. And now this ruling from the Labor Relations Board for the civil service is saying, you know what, you've got to give them back those previous sick days or vacation days that they used and just pay them leave leave with pay for any time that they had to take off due to COVID shutdowns. Again, it just shows that we may have said we're all in this together, but we really weren't.
Brian, the leadership race continues for the Conservative Party of Canada. Now, over the weekend, you published a story about huge crowds Pierre Poilievre is drawing and whether anyone can actually beat him for the leadership. Well, let me ask you, can anyone beat this born and raised Calgarian, Mr. Pierre Poilievre?
It depends. It depends. Look, a lot of the biggest rallies that we saw for Pierre Poilievre were in Alberta. The Conservative Party already does really well in Alberta, and you have to remember how the voting system works. For Pierre Poilievre to win, he has to keep drawing those crowds and selling the memberships in other parts of the country, Ontario, Quebec, Atlantic Canada. Each riding, and there's 338 of them, is allocated 100 points. As long as your riding has 100 members, then when voting day comes, you can have 10,000 members in a riding or 100 members in a riding. That riding is worth 100 points. So you've got to make sure that you've got support spread out across the country. So the crowds are impressive. And if he keeps drawing them everywhere he goes, and if he's selling the memberships and they come out and vote, then yeah, he's going to win. But it's not a shoo-in. It's not guaranteed. There have been many times across many parties where you're using preferential ballot or you're using runoffs, which you have to do when you've got a bunch of candidates. And I think there's, 11 in the race now, where you see someone come up the middle and end up winning. So, the Jean Charest camp, the Patrick Brown camp, the Leslie Lewis camp, they're all telling me that they're in it to win it and that they have the ability to do so and that they're selling memberships where it matters. So for Patrick Brown, that includes going into not just immigrant and ethnic communities across the country, minority communities, and saying, look, I'm here for your religious freedom. But he also told me that he's going into municipalities and he always meets with the firefighter and police unions to say, hey, I'm a big city mayor. I didn't put in vaccine mandates. Jean Charest is going across the country appealing to a different crowd than Pierre Poilievre and trying to make sure that he's signing up members in places where he needs to win, Ontario, Quebec, and Atlantic Canada, but they say they won't forget the West. And then Leslie Lewis is using her base within social conservatives to expand beyond that, like she did last time. Her worry has to be, is a lot of the excitement that she picked up, especially across the West last time, is that being taken up now by Pierre Poilievre?
It's interesting too. I was watching what David Aiken, one of our former co-workers, was tweeting. He's now with Global National, obviously, and he's tweeting about how Jean Charest is not really drawing a lot of people with some of his crowds. He had maybe 20 or 30 people come out recently in cottage country in Ontario, where Pierre Poilievre thousands upon thousands of people. What are you seeing with some of the other candidates outside of the memberships? What kind of crowds are they really drawing?
None of them are drawing close to what Pierre Poilievre is drawing. But again, it depends on how you're selling memberships. As I said, if Pierre's drawing these crowds everywhere and selling the memberships, he's going to win. And look, he's doing some smart things. Like if you're waiting in the photo line, they're coming along and asking you if you're a member. And, it'd be kind of awkward if you get up to meet Pierre and you don't have a membership. They're selling them on the spot there. If the others are going in and doing meetings of 20, 30 people, but they're getting the membership numbers they need, then the crowd size doesn't matter. It's all about selling memberships and then getting those people out to vote where it matters. Because, small town New Brunswick may have fewer members, but they count just as much. They count more come election time than 10,000 people in one riding in Alberta.
Elon Musk's attempt to take over Twitter was denounced because it would allow the billionaire to own a media outlet. But Brian, last time I checked, Amazon's Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, and Canada's very own David Thompson owns Reuters.
Yeah, people forget about that. And David Thompson, by the way, last time I checked the Forbes rich list, he's number 26. He's doing pretty well for himself. and he owns the Globe and Mail. I believe his holding company owns significant shares of Bell Media, and he owns Reuters, one of the world's global giant wire services. You've got Michael Bloomberg, who's just ahead of David Thompson. He owns, oh, what's his news service called? Oh, yeah, Bloomberg. And then you've got Mark Zuckerberg owning Facebook. So, look, it's a bit bizarre. They only seem to like or dislike billionaires buying things if they disagree with them politically. I'm neither here nor there on Elon Musk. I find him to be an interesting curiosity. I'm not actually sure of his politics. I know a lot of conservatives are embracing him suddenly. I'm not sure where his politics actually lie. They may be all over the place, but he has said he wants to buy Twitter in order to bring free speech back. And a lot of conservatives have been worried that they've been shadow banned, they've been downgraded on Twitter, that they're not allowed to say what they think, or they'll be kicked off. Musk has said he's going to fix that, and he made that plea actually at a TED Talk in Vancouver last week. That was interesting. But this seems to be annoying an awful lot of people who say, well, if we're allowed free speech, I'm out of here. All right, don't let the door hit you on the way out.
Political reporter and Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Hal.